You're listening to The Edge with Mark Thompson.
This is Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Mark Thompson is a huge loser. His show, very bad, weak, soft. But if you're interested in crap and you're a communist, you can go to edge-show.com. I don't recommend it.
Hi, this is Mark. I should mention right away I'm recording this particular introduction into the iPhone, but the rest of the episode, I promise you the sound quality will be fine. It's done in a studio. We'll visit with Michael Shure. He's in New Hampshire. We'll talk about the debacle that was Iowa and what's going on in New Hampshire, the state of American politics. That's for the first few minutes, but the focus of this episode is a new documentary produced by Joaquin Phoenix. It's called The Animal People, and it follows animal activists charged with terrorism. This is not particularly, even though the episode starts sort of giving you a feel for what they were shining a light on, which was laboratory testing of animals. This is not really about animal testing and about that world of animal activism. Instead, it's about the power of the government and corporate power as played out through the government to organize and establish a strategy, and this is the key part, a legal strategy that is used against these activist groups, branding them legally as terrorists, and as a result, building a case around terrorism that puts them away for much longer periods of time, has a dramatic chilling effect on their voice, right? Because now you're facing serious time as a terrorist if convicted. And this template, this strategy is used to stamp out activism of all sorts. Leave aside animal activism. I'm talking about Occupy Wall Street, activism against nukes, Black Lives Matter, whatever it might be. The power of the government to choke off free speech and activism is one that was amplified through this case that you're going to hear about. And the documentary is amazing because it follows these people through years and years, and it's well documented with video and a narrative punctuated by real-time interviews. And you see what happens to these lives and these people who never broke a law, but ultimately are prosecuted for conspiracy, for their website and their rhetoric inspiring others. So I'll be joined by the film's co-director and one of the activists at the center of this controversy. Thanks for all the ways you support this show. Thanks for the 5-star reviews. Thank you for going to our website for if you're going to buy on Amazon anyway. Somebody's buying on Amazon. I don't know who it is, but I see the trucks everywhere and they're doing really well. So if you're going to do it anyway, please do it through our website, edge-show.com. You click on anywhere it says Amazon, and an episode you go in, it says Amazon, click through, we get a little piece of whatever you spend. If you want to reach us, we're edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. And now, let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage it means.
Hey, look, I just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
He's a fan favorite, and he joins us from the campaign trail in New Hampshire. He's Michael Shure, everybody.
Hello.
Yes.
Good to be here.
Oh, Michael, we've missed you. The whole Iowa debacle, and now we're into New Hampshire, the impeachment and the acquittal. I mean, there's a lot to cover, and we have about 9 minutes to do it.
Okay, well, start where you'd like.
All right, Let's start with the political process, okay? Because I want to talk about what happened in Iowa. You are in New Hampshire right now. This is what you do for a living. You cover these political races. All that effort, all that concentration on Iowa. And as you know, I feel as though we're completely ass backwards in the way we do these primaries. And I know, I'm not at all alone in that. But Iowa, nonetheless, leading this process, the primary process, and it's a complete meltdown there.
It is. I mean, there are a couple of ways of looking at it, Mark. There was a political journalist you may remember, Jack Germond, right? And
Sure.
Jack Germond wrote for the Baltimore Evening Sun, and he was very matter-of-fact about everything that happened in an era where it was charming and accepted, and people looked at it. Now everybody is alarmist, right? Here's what Jack Germond would have said the other night. He would have said, that's taking a little longer to count. There were some problems with an app, and they'll count it, and then they'll move on. And next week, no one will be talking about it. No one will go to the polls in November and look back and say, I'm going to vote for this guy because of what happened in Iowa. So everything is not an emergency. Yes, it certainly didn't go well, but it's worse for the Iowa Democratic Party than it is for anybody else. It's worse for their standing in terms of going first, though I imagine they will go first again. It's worse for the caucus idea, though I imagine there'll be a caucus again in 4 years.
Yeah,
I do think what it does is it deprives, in this case, Pete Buttigieg more than anybody, the chance to say, we won, which he did anyway, at some risk of embarrassment later, but little risk because everyone will be paying attention to something else. And the real storyline out of Iowa, everyone's going to rush to what happened with the ballots and the app and all that. The real story out of Iowa is what a terrible night Joe Biden had. And I think that that's the legacy of Iowa, and that would have been the legacy of Iowa if it had gone perfectly that night. We would still be talking about how Joe Biden needs to rejigger his campaign, or else he may be dead in the water. So I don't know that it affected as much as the alarmists wanted to say that it affected things.
I would like to just for a moment push back a little on the Jack Germond thing, although I love that reference to Jack Germond and the idea that obviously in this environment we do magnify everything in ways and with strategies that we didn't in the past because of social media and the rest. But isn't that important? In other words, in this time of social media, in this time of media scrutiny with all these cable channels that, need content and need to amplify a lot of what's going on, isn't it then important, some of the stuff that's going on? I mean, you're probably right from a bottom line standpoint, but meantime, you're seeing things like, see, Democrats can't even run a primary in Iowa. How, and you want them to run the healthcare system?
Well, but from that point, because that connection is silly, and that would be debunked very quickly by whoever the Democrat that was selling the healthcare system, because it has nothing to do with what went wrong in Iowa. Sure, it should have gone better. Sure, it's embarrassing. It's ridiculous that this wasn't tested. It's ridiculous that they didn't have a dress rehearsal when all of these changes were happening in the way that they counted Iowa, that they didn't do it in a dress rehearsal. But that's on a handful of people in Iowa, and they're all Democrats, and it's the Democratic Party, and it looks terrible. But everything doesn't have to be a house fire. You don't have to fire the coach every time you go on a 3-game losing streak. And I think that that's part of what Jack Germond would take from it. And you don't have to agree with it. It's just my take. And it's my take because I think in the context of the way that we look at things and the length of an election season, it's not going to have a lasting effect. I may be wrong, but I don't think it will. I think had it gone, and I'll repeat it, had it gone perfectly the other night, we'd be sitting here talking about, oh, my God, what does Joe Biden do? And now what I want to talk about is, oh, my God, what does Joe Biden do? Because that's still the postscript of this event in Iowa.
And now to New Hampshire, where you are now. And now specifically in New Hampshire, what is the significance of New Hampshire?
Wait, you're going to go right by that disaster in Iowa? Sorry. So here's what I think about New Hampshire. I mean, New Hampshire is obviously, it is now a proving ground of the strength of what New Hampshire always does, is it gives someone a chance to come back. The person that needs to come back the most in New Hampshire is not Joe Biden, it's Elizabeth Warren. If Elizabeth Warren does not come in third in New Hampshire, it's going to be hard for her to sell herself anywhere else after this primary. And everyone's talking about Biden. People are talking about Buttigieg and Sanders, who won, and they should be. And the reason that they should be is because that's important, right? That's defining the race right now. But Elizabeth Warren is a candidate that has spent a lot of money and a lot of political capital. And I think her results in Iowa were somewhat underwhelming, and that she did lose handily to Buttigieg. And now she has New Hampshire, the neighbor state. She's got to do well here, and that's what I'm looking for in Iowa. Joe Biden has time to come back. I think he's okay if he finishes fourth here. I don't think Elizabeth Warren is okay.
Wow, that's big. She's the other progressive sort of and I use progressive in quotes. I think it's thrown around a lot and given as a label to people who probably don't deserve it. But she's certainly progressive-ish. Yeah, right. Right. So we get to what, Michael? Let's round this off, and then I want to double back to impeachment. So out of New Hampshire, we get to what? This is when the race really takes off. We get to primaries that Michael Bloomberg is part of, for example.
Exactly. You don't get to those quite yet because you have Nevada and then you have South Carolina, but you might see Mayor Bloomberg on a debate stage. And he's spending such an extraordinary amount of money. He's spending it wisely. He's hiring a ton of people, and he will be difficult for these people to contend with. I mean, Deval Patrick and Michael Bennet are running in New Hampshire. Let's say that the Biden voters who were underwhelmed by him in Iowa are looking for somebody who isn't an Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg, who is, in fact, more toward the middle where they want to be. They like Klobuchar, but they want, Deval Patrick because they know him. They want Michael Bennet because he seems more reasonable and calm. But even if these guys, if Michael Bennet wins New Hampshire, Mike Bloomberg is waiting for all of them. And that's something that no one can predict the power there, because his numbers are going up in places where they might not have heard of Mike Bloomberg before he spent this money, the same way that Tom Steyer's had that effect in Nevada, polling at 12, 13, 17%. Those numbers are unheard of for someone, but for the fact that he spent so much money.
Now let's double back to the impeachment. The political courage associated with Mitt Romney could really be ascribed to Doug Jones, right? He had even more on the line than Romney. Doesn't come up for re-election for some time, right?
He is. I mean, Doug Jones is up this year. It took tremendous courage. I mean, we talk about courage. These people did what was right? We translate it to courage now because we've seen it be impossible to go against your own party.
Right. We've seen an entire party cowed, and I've also seen them in lockstep, as Michael says, sort of out of fear. And just to reset, Michael, though, when we talk about Romney and we talk about Doug Jones, we're talking about two guys who did what?
They voted to convict the president. One is a Republican. He was the only one who voted to convict the president. One's a Democrat who's up for election in a state that Donald Trump won with 62% of the vote, and who won by the skin of his teeth against a madman, really, in Roy Moore. Not because he's a Republican. There are 1,000 Republicans who aren't madmen. But this is somebody who was crazy, Roy Moore, and Doug Jones barely beat him. Doug Jones
in Alabama,
In Alabama. Doug Jones is up in November. An easy vote would have been in support of a president who's very popular in Alabama. The tough vote, but the vote that a man of conscience like Doug Jones made was the vote to convict. And he made it seemingly, he had a hard time coming to it, but when he did, he felt right about it. He's someone who's fought for civil rights. He prosecuted Klansmen. He has a storied history in doing what is societally right. He looked at this and he said, I took an oath, and this looked to me like he was guilty, so I'm going to vote for what I think is right. I think he was unlikely to win before, and is probably more likely to win after, not because he's going to woo voters, but I think people who may have been on the fence with him, independents, in a state like Alabama where there aren't too many of them, might say, you know what, I like what he did. I like that courage.
Oh, wow. You think he actually might benefit a bit from it?
I do. I actually do. I think that it's a tiebreaker doing the right thing. I think he's going to get a lot of flack from people in Alabama as well.
You always maintain, I didn't mean to interrupt, but you always maintained on this show that there had to be a moment of the political winds changing and blowing against Donald Trump. And when that happened, and you said, probably would happen with just maybe one or two or a handful of legislators, turning on him. When I say turning on him, meaning saying, no, we're not good with, sending troops to the border under, quote, national emergency or whatever, to just produce some political, right. In other words, there's so many different policies you could draw the line on. But you suggested sort of when that happens, the rest of the birds will start to fly with that flock.
Right.
I keep waiting for that moment. We haven't really seen it. And I'm wondering if you can just give me a thought or two on that.
No, I think that it's not going to happen now. It would have happened in the past month or so. It would have happened since the new year. And Donald Trump's approval numbers had to go down for it to happen, and they didn't. And it is so tribal now that they likely won't. I mean, it was tribal when Nixon was up in Watergate. Not every Republican wanted the president to be impeached, but enough did, and enough hinted that they would vote for it. There isn't any of that with the Republican Party. The Trump brand is so strong with a new voter in so many of these states that it's very difficult for them to move away from it. I'm surprised that one more didn't. I'm surprised that Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski. I'm frankly surprised that someone you did not expect to didn't. That's what it would have taken. Ben Sass in Nebraska, Rob Portman in Ohio, someone out of the blue who said Jerry Moran in Texas. You know what? This was bad, but it didn't happen, and it won't happen certainly until a Trump second term, when it won't matter as much, or it won't matter if the Democrats win.
Just on this point, Michael Shure, there was a piece by Sherrod Brown, an op-ed piece. It was in the New York Times titled, "In Private, Republicans Admit They Acquitted Trump Out of Fear." And it goes on to talk about how there is a culture of fear in Washington that is speaking to what you're talking about. And this kind of put it in a context that that seemed clear to me, of course, but it was still nonetheless interesting to read about it. But it put it in
no question in the fact that if you cross this president, there is no reward for you. You are crossing at your own peril, and that's the end of it. right?
And he has an army of trolls and haters, as you suggest, sort of tribalists who will go after you. But what was interesting about the Sherrod Brown piece, and the reason I bring it up, is he pointed out that in the ramp up to the Iraq War, there was that same feeling of being scared to call it out, scared to go against it.
Well, there is that. I mean, first of all, they're team players, and there are consequences that are paid when you go against it. That's not like it doesn't happen on both sides. If you go against Speaker Pelosi or any speaker, not just Nancy Pelosi, if you went against Paul Ryan or John Boehner, you were in trouble. And it doesn't mean that you were chastised or put in a doghouse, but you were not going to be a big part of the way the leadership ran the House. And it's the same thing here, right? So if you care about your job, well, clearly you have to be careful about who you cross. And they care too much about their job. So many of these people talk about their oath, but they should talk about the fact that they're really addicted to their jobs and their power, which is addicting, clearly.
I love that you said that. To me, it's power. It's power, power, power.
Yeah.
It's really that simple.
There's no question that's what it is, right?
Michael, we need to finish up, but I saw a story that I just couldn't believe it to the point that I had to tell the first person I could speak to, and that's you. A guy he had a $300,000 bill for back spousal support and child support in this divorce settlement that he made. And rather than pay it, he sold his house and property and got all the cash, more than $1 million, and he set it on fire.
Wow.
I mean, it's such insanity, the hate that guy had to have.
This dovetails nicely. I mean, like this guy's doing that, and you're going to get a Republican to vote against Donald Trump?
Yeah, you're right. When you're dug in, damn it.
You're dug in.
He is going to jail for 30 days. Yeah, the judge put him in jail for 30 days.
For burning $1 million.
Well, the judge actually put him in jail for not paying the $300,000 in spousal and child support, but the judge said, look, you've got the money, and I find, this is a quote, I find what you have done to be morally reprehensible.
And he had no money for bail.
That's right. Michael Shure, we love visiting with you. Hey, you're going to come on the radio with me, too, soon?
I would love to. I'm in New Hampshire all week.
All right. I'm a very big radio star. We've got a super hot show. I want to get you on the show with us.
Do you know who I am?
Yeah, exactly. I'm a big deal.
You are a big deal, but we knew that before.
All right. Michael Shure, everybody. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Milty. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
If you enjoy listening to The Edge, support them by subscribing to The Edge on iTunes, Stitcher, and you can listen through the iHeartRadio app. Get busy listening.
And now a conversation not just about a movie, not just about this documentary, but about the world of activism today. This new documentary, The Animal People, is nothing short of terrific. The film's director, Casey Suchan, and one of the activists at the focus of the film, Jake Conroy, with us next. Here's a little flavor of it through the trailer for the movie.
The thing that I remember most distinctly is an FBI agent holding a gun in my face.
We're 6 activists who are indicted under federal terrorism laws.
U.S. attorneys called it a campaign of terrorism.
We didn't break anything. We didn't burn anything. We didn't beat anyone. We didn't even so much as trespass. Our crime is doing exactly what I'm doing right now, speaking.
Any threat to cause a loss of profit to a corporation is now considered an act of terrorism.
We are committed to working with our partners to disrupt and dismantle these movements, to protect our fellow citizens, and to bring to justice those who disrupt business and inflict serious economic damage.
The largest accounting firm in the world just backed up within 24 hours.
This wasn't about solving a crime. This was about sending a message that you better shut up.
You have to have a degree of arrogance to think you can take on multinational corporations and win.
Corporations get to do what they want. We challenge the right of this corporation to exist.
They speak in a language of money. They need to be targeted financially.
We come with a new philosophy. We hold the radical line. We will not compromise. We will not apologize. And we will not relent.
Legitimate business enterprises are suffering.
It's just about the dollar bill.
The world's biggest financial corporations realized one thing, that it wasn't worth it.
The share price dropped from like $30 to a few pennies.
That's not terrorism.
That's effective activism.
Every ounce of progress that we've had towards a more just world has come because there were people who were willing to fight and willing to sacrifice.
The police had set up this free speech zone, which makes you wonder then what's everything outside of the free speech zone.
There were more wiretaps used against people associated with this movement than any other counterterrorism investigation in U.S. history.
There was no direct evidence of any unlawful conduct.
What will happen when the activists move to the timber industry or the defense industry?
If this continues, the extremists will have won, and the loser will be humanity.
Wow. Welcome the film's director, Casey Suchan, and Jake Conroy, activist. Casey.
I would just point out I have a co-director on the film as well, Dennis Henry Hennelly, who couldn't be with us today.
Well, he's not here, so screw him.
So it's mine.
Yeah. No, it's. I can't even believe you did it with just one co-director. There's so much here. And by that I mean you followed a case that took place over such a long period of time, and there's archival footage in this film that goes back 10 years or more even. I want to say 1999. When did it all begin?
Well, Jake can actually speak to that, but before I pass the mic, so to speak, any film is more than just the directors, right? This film started out being documented. Their case started documentation, I think, in 2003, 2004 with Hal Weiss and Andy Roth shooting with you guys, I think, right before the indictment, during the trial process.
It's true. I don't mean to interrupt, but Jake, they did chronicle a lot of this as it was happening. That was one of the things, it was one of the blessings, if you will, of this project, is you had some of that video, right?
Yeah, they were, in a sense, like embedded with us a little bit in the campaign just because they were, activists themselves and mutual friends.
Yeah. So go ahead, Kiz. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So that was the initial team that started, the momentum on this project that then Miko Alan and Ari Solomon, our producers, picked up when they became aware of the project. Then my co-director and I, Dennis Henry Hennelly, I should say, and myself got involved and brought on Sasha Perry, who's also a critical partner. You can't tell a story that traverses so many years without a really robust team of people like digging at it. And then I should also give a nod to the activists over the years who were documenting the actions, the protests that they were doing. The film has a trove of archival material in it because people had the wherewithal to document what they were doing, to show the protests, both, I think, probably to encourage other people to do it, to spread the word. But for us, that meant that we could really bring it to life, even though it's now, nearly 20 years later for some of those protests that you see.
Yeah, it doesn't have a feel of being long ago. And Jake, I'm so glad that they point out already in the trailer something which is at the center of all of this, because this is way beyond animal activism. This is the government and corporate power preventing the disruption of commerce. That's all they care about, is the money. It's not about animal activism. I mean, it is for you activists.
Right.
But clearly that's the message, and that's why I was glad that even if you just watch the trailer, you get that. That's why you're being prosecuted as terrorists, right?
Right. I mean, that it really is like the bottom line to all of this is like it doesn't matter if it's about animals or the environment, or like they say in the trailer, the defense industry, the timber industry. It is about money, and effective activism is activism that disrupts the flow of money, which is ultimately tearing apart, the things that we all care about: the climate, the environment, humans, indigenous communities, non-human animals, everything. And when you start disrupting that and their ability to make money off of it, then they get really upset and they're going to come after you.
So I want to get into a little bit what happened here, though, but I did want to make that point, that it really is applicable, this struggle, to so many different things, as you just suggest, all these different areas. But what they care about is the chain of commerce, of money being disrupted. So the film takes you to what is, to me, clearly a righteous battle, which is to get animals, these sentient, sweet creatures. They really are. I mean, you see beagles and these chimps and all these different kinds of animals, and you see little glimpses of them in the labs, and they perform these awful, torturous, miserable experiments on them where they're, it is, you have in the film, you have conversations with the person who shot undercover in these laboratories, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, I have to say, I had trouble watching it. You don't have a lot of it, to be fair, for those who, so, you can get through it. You're getting to a point which is, this is clearly, to me anyways, a viewer, a righteous battle, as I say. And yet this Huntington Life Sciences in England, it's in England, right?
Yeah, it was in England. It was the name of the place. They've now morphed into a new organization called Envigo.
Okay. But in the movie, they're there and they're doing these experiments, and you activists, expose the horror of Huntington Life Sciences.
There was an undercover investigation that was carried out by a few different individuals back in England. Zoe Broughton. There was another woman, too, wasn't there, that was doing undercover in England, I think.
There was a series of undercover investigations. The first one was in 1989. There was another one in 1997 in the England facilities, and then in 1997 as well in the U.S. facility, which was based in New Jersey. I think there was 5 or 6 undercover investigations in total, but it was a culmination of all those investigations that really started to shed light on the issue inside this particular laboratory.
Yeah, and it was the power of that footage, I think, that really ignited this movement. The footage is, I think anybody would see that footage, and I think that's why you guys were so successful to a certain extent, because you had this footage that you could share back then on VHS, and people could see what was going on, and you didn't have to be some sort of seasoned animal rights activist to see this footage and think this should not be happening. And so I think the movement, once it grew, the SHAC movement, which started in the UK, and Jake, you can speak to this, was able to gather a lot of energy from people across a wide spectrum of backgrounds and what kind of activism they were comfortable in.
And I should just, before, Jake, when you say SHAC, that's an acronym for Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, is that it?
Right, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure we talk about it.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Jake, I'm sorry. That footage, look, I like to do this where I say, go ahead, Jake, and then I'll cut you off.
No, I actually was pausing because I forgot what the question was, but yeah, so I appreciate it.
So I'll reset. That footage, that is the key. It's a linchpin to so many revelations. When you see the way animals are treated in the factory farming world, you reconsider being supportive of that with your money. That is the power, is what Casey's saying, of the footage that was released and was so much a part of that investigation.
For sure. I mean, we are a visual creature. We like to see everything. We don't want to read very much. I think we're predominantly lazy animals. And so we want to listen and we want to see what's going on. It's much easier for us. And so I think that undercover footage was so critical because people could relate to what was going on inside of it. They could see the dog and they could see the cat and they could say, these are the animals that live in my homes that I share my life with, and they're being treated this way. And it got a lot of people to react to it and want to take action. And I think that was one of the beautiful things about the campaign. It wasn't just radical vegans or radical animal rights activists. There was vegetarians, there was omnivores, there was people. I remember one guy showing up at a demonstration in New Jersey in a suit and tie, and we're like, who are you and where did you come from? He's like, I was on my lunch break and I saw your video on a stall, information table you were doing in New York City, and I just had to do something, and I came down here, took the train down, and came out to this demonstration. It was like that was the power of the campaign, to start bringing a lot of people together from a lot of different walks of life, a lot of different belief systems, but all wanted to fight against something that they felt really passionately about, and we could all do it together.
I think what's interesting about it is that footage was so powerful that it was suppressed from the actual trial. Once these 6 activists that the government identified out of hundreds were brought to task for this campaign for being in the government's narrative, quote unquote, leaders of this campaign and quote unquote inciting incidents, that footage was refused to be seen by the jury. And so part of what we wanted to do with the film was reframe this narrative. So right now, the only narrative that exists, there's a lot of stuff online, of course, that's a very robust place as well, but is the government narrative that kind of unfolds during the trial. And it's super powerful and super compelling. It went on for 9 days, and they had all the resources to fly witnesses in and experts. They had been working on this campaign tirelessly with hundreds and hundreds of agents across, different forces throughout the nation for such a long time.
And there's a reason for that, not to interrupt, but just to make a point, because they're building more than just a case against these activists. They're building a template. They're building a plan and a strategy that can then be applied to all of the different forums that activists operate in. So then you go against the anti-nuclear activists and the environmental activists who are protesting maybe a coal plant or whatever it may be. It could be anything. In other words, once you have this plan in place, then everything becomes sort of plug and play.
And it was so easy because for so many people, particularly in that year, right, 2004, 2005, this was still a very fringe movement. I think happily we're in a different place right now, but back then, like, animal rights was so fringe. Like, imagine trying to apply this to somebody that the entire country agreed was a quote unquote noble cause, you know, something that more people that weren't so fringe could get behind. So it was really like a bird in the hand kind of opportunity that the government and the FBI had to build this kind of, like you said, playbook. I mean, do you want to speak to that?
I think that's exactly right. But I think also the disappointing part about it was that, you know, because we were so fringe and we were also kind of, you know, more or less like a more radical movement within the broader movement, a lot of people didn't want to support us. They didn't want to talk to us. They didn't want to help us. You know, we would go to places like the ACLU literally begging, can you please just look at this case? Like, it is monumental. The implications of how it could be applied to all of you next. And they just, no, we're not interested, not interested. We support this law, we support the case, so forth and so on. Going to other organizations within the animal rights movement and the animal welfare movement and say, you could be next, you could be next. And they say, no, not interested. You know, we're not interested in helping. And we were left, you know. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of resources. We used mostly lawyers from, you know, court-appointed attorneys, and they were in over their heads as well. And we got kind of thrown to the wolves, so to speak. And
it's astounding that those places that you just mentioned didn't want to touch this case, because you think of them as taking on the difficult cases, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you
exactly.
think of ACLU, you think and other animal rights organizations, they certainly have resources to even pool their resources with others.
Yeah.
The fact that they wouldn't touch it is remarkable to me.
Yeah.
It's shameful.
And now the ACLU, for instance, is fighting against similar situations just like this with pipeline protesters and, you know, that are now facing similar charges of terrorism.
It's the same point I was just making. They now have the template for these other protests. So let's go back to the Huntington Life Science situation again. The video that came out showed this horrible mistreatment of these creatures. Okay, first of all, the experiments themselves are horrible. Okay, we understand. But I'm leaving that aside for a moment. I'm talking about the way they handle the animals, the way they treat the animals, the way they raise the animals. There is no humanity to it. It is indefensible. And I might just add as a quick aside, it doesn't work to apply to the human population. So it doesn't even make any medical sense to do these things. So you say, well, why is it happening? And of course, it doesn't make sense. It's about money. It's a huge industry, right? But when they were confronted with this, they denied it. Huntington Life Science said, well, you know, that was a little piece of video of one lab worker or a couple of lab workers. It's not a big deal, right? They tried to shove it off. But you did something very clever as activists. You went after their financiers. You went after the money. And that was a quite effective strategy going forward.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that strategy was taken from the anti-apartheid movement. When people around the world wanted to fight apartheid in South Africa, it was hard to do, but you could go after all the banks that financed and supported that country. And that was really, you know, what essentially crippled apartheid in South Africa. And kind of, again, learning from movements and activists in your past and in our histories and learning how we can apply them to what we're doing now, I think is vital in order to making social change. And that's what we did, and it worked really, really well.
So what happened to them in the? I mean, without giving away too much, I just want to kind of give people a flavor for the plot as it moves along. I've kind of started things off at the beginning with Huntington Life Sciences and this effort. And as you say, it turns out a very effective strategy in trying to shutter their doors, which is ultimately what happens. They also have, just as I remember, the efficacy of your plan was met with because when the video got out, it was like radioactive. Like, oh my God, as you say, it was just like, I can't believe this. It didn't produce a memo from Huntington Life Sciences saying, hey, listen, in our experiments and treatments of the animals, we have to be more careful. It's become to our attention that, you know, we're mistreating many of these animals and they do look to be abused. They said, hey, when you're treating the animals, make sure that there are no cameras around. You know, you don't get caught is really with the message that they sent internally, right?
Well, that was what one of the undercover investigators that we talked to, that was certainly her perception that she got in the moment when this footage in the UK broke. I mean, I think these places, there's a culture of violence there, and that's one of the questions that kind of reverberates through the film, you know, and that one of the defendants in this case, Lauren Gazzola, really points to at the end of the movie is that until we start to think about what is violence, are we going to change as a culture, and do we have the capacity to change, I think is something everybody needs to think about. What Michelle Roque says in the film that was so powerful, She said a lot of powerful things that didn't make the cut. Everyone did, unfortunately. But one thing she said was that, when you're at work, you can imagine when you get frustrated with your computer, you might hit it, or shake it to get it to work, even though that's not an effective strategy when working with electronics. It's the same kind of, it's that dehumanization process, I think, that happens with people who are working with these animals that are just frustrating. For them, it's just it's an effort that they need to make that's getting frustrated because there's a conscious creature that's getting in the way of their job, right? And so I think there must just be a culture of desensitization that's probably like a little bit necessary to get through that. I would imagine that you would come out of a place like that quite traumatized, even if you're not recognizing it when you have to work like that every day, right?
Yeah,
violence breeds violence, right? So when you're conducting violence on animals every day, it kind of makes sense that you would become a more violent person and start to treat them that way. It's terrible.
That's a great point, too. It changes the aspect of who you are when you deal with them that way.
Yeah.
But we look at animals as things, right, in this
Absolutely.
And so that lab environment is no different. These are just things. I got to do this, and I got to get this thing to shut the F up because I'm getting annoyed by this. So what happens? They have an American arm of this place as well, right? So your shack protest comes to the shores of America.
Yeah, we start an organization called Shack USA. We're the U.S. chapter of Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, which originated in England. And it was just a handful of us living in a row house in Philadelphia, sitting around a table that we bought at a thrift store with some, old dumpy computers and trying to figure out how to take down one of the world's largest corporations of its kind and just going for it. We were scrappy kids. We learned a lot from past movements and from the people in England and just started applying it to what we had to work with in the United States. Just the general idea of you can protest against a corporation all you want, but if you start affecting the things that corporation needs to exist, then you can start making real change. A corporation needs insurance, they need bank accounts, they need the internet, they need food in the cafeteria, they need people to clean the bathrooms, they need all that stuff. And if you can start picking away those pieces, you start pulling the bricks out of their foundation, they eventually crumble. And that company has no recourse, really. I mean, they have some recourse, obviously, but they can only replace those bricks in their foundation so fast before, they can't keep up with it. And it's successful.
So there was a time when it was working so well. I mean, that this thing was getting such life that you must have thought, well, this is so terrific. I mean, we're fighting the good fight and we're winning.
Absolutely. And that's rare, I think, in activist movements. I think it was even rarer at the time in the animal rights movement that we saw not only victories, but really big victories. We were getting some of the largest corporations, the largest financial institutions, largest pharmaceutical institutions to pull out of supporting this laboratory. We got this laboratory removed from the New York Stock Exchange. And this wasn't with some fancy, campaign strategies or people that had been in the business industry for a long time. It was a bunch of scrappy kids that just figuring this stuff out and getting these companies removed from the stock exchange, I think scares the living hell out of people,
And I think what's so empowering about what Jake's talking about is that it wasn't like Shack was this giant, well-financed organization.
It wasn't Greenpeace.
No, being run by people with years of experience. These were just young people who were passionate and who had the ability to inspire and empowered other activists in other cities, to do actions in their own backyard that would lead towards a collective victory. So what was brilliant, I think, about the strategy was that most of the major targets you chose had offices globally. So no matter where you were, if you wanted to be part of this campaign, you could organize an effort independently in a way that you were comfortable with, wherever that fell on the spectrum. And take part and be a part of this effort. So it was just an absolutely brilliant strategy in that. Now, a lot of things, what's so fascinating to me, because it could only have happened when it happened. Because without the internet, which was really just becoming something that people were starting to get, access to in their homes in those years, 2000, 2001, this kind of campaigning, I think, would have been a lot more challenging. And it could have only really been perfected in the way that it was by young people, because these are the people who knew how to access and use that tool and be creative with it. So there were a lot of things that were falling into place to make this a successful movement. Simultaneously, there were a lot of things that were falling into place to mount a successful prosecution against a movement like this. And one of those things, of course, would have been 9/11 and this new kind of injection of opportunity, I guess you could say, that people who wanted to push back against effective activism had this little gift of the label of terrorism
That's
that
what
they
you're
could
talking
start
about.
liberally applying towards movements like this.
Exactly. And so what Casey's talking about is that 9/11 changed the legal situation of terrorists. Everybody recognizes the danger of terrorism and the fear of terrorism, and in that danger and fear come tough laws. Like if you're
Very quickly. It becomes very easy to push legislation through very quickly that doesn't have a chance to be fully vetted or really fully thought out. You just get on board. If you want to get reelected and someone's throwing that word out, I'm assuming you just get on board.
Yeah, how could you say I voted against that legislation because it had some problems with it? Well, so you voted against legislation to prosecute terrorists? I mean, how can that possibly be a good thing?
Yeah, and the industry itself, I mean, prior to 9/11 was definitely throwing around the word terrorist. It's not like that was new.
No.
But it was this kind of opportunity, I think, that just ran with it.
It was a brand new political climate that shifted from the war on drugs to the war on terror. And it was an opportunity. It was a perfect storm for them to really take advantage of it and start propelling their own personal careers and their own interests forward.
Yeah, you think about eco-terrorists. It was a term that was around, but the idea, as you say, it became more powerful as a branding.
Absolutely. And as a career mover, I think as we were researching the film and the story, and as we were filming this story, Ryan Shapiro, who does a lot of FOIA work, and it keeps the FBI very busy and it is a big nuisance to them, thankfully for us, uncovered Operation Trail Mix, which we talk about in the film, which was this kind of blanket effort, and I think a really snarky name, to be honest, that the FBI was chasing a few different, clearly illegal things. However you feel about them, whether they're righteous or not. They were things like, vandalism, break-ins at universities, arsons, these kinds of things kind of under this umbrella. Some of it, I think, was earth liberation. Some of it was animal liberation. But it was all clearly illegal on the books of the state laws. What's fascinating is that it was that effort that translated into a prosecution against 6 individuals, none of which ever broke the law, right? But that effort had to go somewhere because all that money that was being spent and all that investigation had to amount to something. So that's another piece of this perfect storm. That investigation was going on before 9/11, but again, with this injection, I think, and these new tools could kind of coalesce around the indictment of these 6 individuals who were really just vocal leaders, amazing, inspirational speakers in their own right, who could activate people.
Let's talk about that. So they go after the activists, and there are no laws being broken. Then how can they prosecute you?
Through conspiracy charges, essentially. The idea that your speech or your actions or your webpage, in this case, could inspire unknown people around the world to read or see or listen to what you're doing and encouraging them to go out and take that action. It's like the wink and the nod, right? I mean, conspiracy is as simple as if you and I walk down the hallway and pass each other and give ourselves a wink and a nod, and somehow no verbal communication, but if that means, hey, we're going to rob that bank later, even if we never rob the bank, that wink and a nod is enough to get you a conspiracy charge and put you in prison for the same crime as if you had actually robbed the bank. So the idea that if we say, hey, we should protest against this corporation, you should do it however you want, it's your decision, and then someone goes out and does those things months and months later, and maybe they write a letter, maybe they hold a protest sign, maybe they throw a brick through a window. We are now responsible for those people's actions because we suggested that people engage in protest activity.
I mean, it's cruel and chilling when you think about it, how intense that prosecution was and continues to be on others in the activist movement when it's a legal magic trick almost, isn't it?
To a certain extent, yeah, but I also think it's about ego. It's the fact that there's people running around the country engaging in, quote unquote, illegal activism, like Casey was saying, whether that's vandalism or liberation or arson, and they just can't figure it out. This, economic sabotage has been going on since the beginning of the United States, the founding of the United States, and particularly like through the 60s and 70s into the 80s and 90s as it transitioned from the, anti-war movement and the civil rights movement into the environmental and animal rights movement. This economic sabotage, they just can't figure out who are doing these things. And they want someone to be held accountable. So it looks like they're prosecuting them. And so they go after the only people they can find, which are the people that are public, that are out, and who aren't doing these things, but are saying like, hey, we support the idea of them. We're sharing the ideas of them, and therefore just as guilty as the people that are engaging in these actions.
Also, it's a weak group in terms of finances and your young people. I mean, with limited resources, it's such a low-hanging fruit. And as you say, or as I can certainly say, I mean, it's a fraudulent legal jihad they're on. But I think, Casey, you make such a great point to recast it in the framework of post 9/11 and how that became really the fire that allowed them to burn these activists at the stake.
Well, I think, I think there's also the thing that I want people to think about wherever they're thinking about animal rights or not. I think what was being burned at the stake in this situation was free speech. Very clearly, particularly the 6 individuals who were indicted in this case, made very careful efforts to follow the letter of the law and encourage people who were protesting in their own communities to make sure that there were, that the police knew about the protests in cases where there were time, place, and manner restrictions to follow them. People who violated the terms were arrested. Like there was action taken. There were police present at these protests. There were a certain number of people who could be at these protests. Everything was done legally within the dynamic of these 6 people who were indicted. The FBI did wiretaps on their phones and couldn't find evidence of any conspiracy or illegal activity. I don't know that I've listened to all 4,000 hours or whatever, but we've listened to a lot. And they certainly didn't introduce anything in trial that proved that there was a conspiracy of illegal activity. It was quite a dance that they did. But, a jury trial is an emotional thing. And I think that to the detriment of the defendants in this case, the prosecution, which was led by Chris Christie, as then Attorney General of New Jersey, understood that a jury trial is an emotional experience. It's storytelling. And and you can correct me if you feel differently, But after talking to the lawyers in the defense, I think that there was just this kind of naive belief that, but they didn't break any law. There's no proof that they broke any law. And that just doesn't matter to a jury, does it? If they're feeling emotionally like, we don't like this kind of protest. They don't know why they're doing that kind of protest. They just want to hold someone accountable, right? So I forgot what the initial thing I was responding to, but I think it's the freedom of speech thing.
That's what you started
to come
with,
back to that, like there wasn't. That's what's so chilling about this case, is that there was no evidence that any of these individuals had broken any law. They were being held accountable for speaking on behalf and praising people who did choose to break the law with very careful parameters, by the way, never inciting violence, being really careful to always say, we don't support violence against human or non-human animals. And again, this is where the question of violence comes up, which I think the film wants you to think about. Is vandalism violence?
And is the violence that's going on the inside of these institutions that you're creating a furor around, isn't that worth our attention?
Yes,
I mean, it's such a bizarre contradiction, that these people who are perpetrating heinous acts of violence that you're drawing attention to, they walk away scot-free, and then those who are drawing attention to it don't.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember after the investigations came out in 1997, 1998, the laboratory in England was shut down for 6 months by the government and given a bunch of fines. And in the United States laboratory was given, I think, a $50,000 fine for what they did, which is a slap on the wrist for a corporation like that. And the response of like, this is how the public responds. Well, the response to our response is like, you are all essentially terrorists for engaging in some sort of reaction to what violence is already being perpetrated.
I want you to take us a little bit through the trial, but before we get to it, I did want to, I think we've talked about it in some sort of general sense, but they really crushed you, even just in the way they arrested you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was brutal, man.
Yeah.
You would have thought you guys had bombed the World Trade Center type thing. I mean, it's unreal, right?
Yeah, it was intense. I've been arrested a handful of times in my life, or maybe more, and that was by far one of the craziest experiences. I mean, for our house, which was the Shack USA office where Kevin, myself, and Lauren of the defendants were living at the time, you know, they came in with the battering ram and 20, 30 guys in full body armor, you know, ski mask, balaclavas, guns, you know, they came in ready for war to round up these 3 nonviolent protesting, you know, people that they had deemed were the biggest threat to the security of the nation. And you know, they came in hard, helicopters, you know, everything. It was intense.
And when you see Jake in the film, and you all should see the film, he's standing in like a CVS or a Ralph's parking lot or something like that. And unfortunately, it didn't make the cut. But one of my favorite moments among many is you being like, this whole thing was a command center. I mean, when you see that parking lot, it was filled with vehicles, you know, that were tapped into the 20 or 30 guys that were at your house down the street.
There was easily another 20 or 30 people running the command center down the street at the grocery store parking lot.
It's insane and frustrating to think about the money and the resources that went into that when there's so many worthier things to be spending money and resources on in this country.
You took the words right out of my head. I was going to say this. I was going to think about the waste of resources.
And the crazy thing is that we were, all of us, all 6 of us, 7 of us at the time, were released on our own recognizance within a handful of hours. Like, we weren't thrown in jail, and because we were these horrible, terrible terrorists that they needed to keep locked up. Literally, in like 4 or 5 hours, we were all back at our house.
Yeah. So then what happens? Can you take us, without giving away too much? I don't know, Casey, you're the filmmaker here, so I don't want to give away too much. But can you take us through some of the beats of the trial? You talk about the fact that obviously you're overmatched as activists by the government case, which is clearly full of all the waste we just alluded to. And I don't mean to, look, I'm not against the U.S. government in every way, but here I'm definitely against the U.S. This is craziness, an absolute, there are real lives at stake, real, I think, real good being done, drawing attention to heinous activities going on in these labs, and yet we mount this case as a government against these activists. So what happens? They try all 6 at once? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I want to build on what you just said, because what's so frustrating is that they weren't actually trying to find the people who were breaking the laws. Like, go find the people who committed the vandalism, arrest them, find them, put them in jail for what would that be? Not very long for vandalism.
It's a misdemeanor is what is the reality.
Right? So, but they weren't, either they weren't making that effort, or they couldn't find those people, which is shocking considering the amount of resources that they were spending on this, the amount of people who were working on it. But they just wanted to shut everything. They just wanted to shut this whole campaign down because it was so effective. Marsh Inc., I think their contract, Marsh Inc. is an insurance company, and their contract with HLS, I think, was worth for them on paper, I think like $100,000. I probably shouldn't. It was not a big contract, right? It wasn't worth a lot of money. They were spending $2 million a month fighting this campaign.
Wow.
In terms of undercover investigators and increased securities and this kind of stuff.
Slap suits.
Yep. Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, they're the ones that came after you guys the hardest with the lawsuits, right?
For over a year.
And they, in the government affidavits, Marsh had said to an investigator that they weren't going to back down because of the fact that they lost so many employees in the World Trade Centers to terrorism. They weren't going to bow to terrorism. So it's so interesting, right?
That's
the narrative that was happening.
They're trying to build that narrative.
So as far as like covering in trial the story of the campaign and what happened to these 6 people and trying to do that in 90 minutes is near to impossible to do. You really have to oversimplify it, and it's super heartbreaking. But what we tried to, the decision we made was to try to capture that emotional narrative that Marsh was feeling, that the targets of this campaign were feeling, and focus on that part of the story, right? Because there was a lot of stuff we couldn't cover, like PGP, which stands for Pretty Good Privacy, which was an encryption program that the activists used to communicate with each other, because they knew, because they were activists, that they were being monitored by government agencies. That didn't mean they were communicating about breaking the law. They weren't, but because the government couldn't crack it, or because they were even using it, that was part of a story that they used to get the jury to think, oh, they must be breaking the law. Why else would they need encryption, right? Today, we all use encryption. If you're not using encryption, you should use encryption. Right. So those were the kind of stories that we couldn't tell in the trial, just for timing. But
yeah, you feel like there's a director's cut with 5 hours in there.
My God. I mean, I really think it should have been a multiple part series, really. You know, there's so many people who worked on this campaign who, as you dig into the research and you talk to people, you kind of go, well, why weren't you indicted? Why were they indicted? And why weren't you? You seemed to be just as, indictable.
Right.
I'm going to get a T-shirt that says indictable.
It's true. I think a lot of us could wear it. So I'm struggling because I don't want to. Can you tell us what you can about the journey then through the trial? How long it took and what
I can
happened?
say. I don't know. I think that the trial. I feel like if you've been listening, you probably already know how it went.
I
haven't been very
It's the
good
journey
about,
as opposed to the
hiding.
destination.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jake. That's true.
It reminds me of that Apollo 13. Is that what it was? Apollo 13, where you know what happened.
Right.
But you go to the movie because the movie is riveting. I mean, honestly, and it's made riveting. And I want to get back to it, but I guess is kind of my plea for everybody to see it, regardless of whether we get to every result and where are they now. I'd like to get a little bit of that. But the movie's riveting because it brings you back to all of these moments that are so compelling. I mean, it's not just these labs. You get into this activist world, and it's so well documented because that's what you guys did. You documented so much of this. And the other thing I would say is, wow, it's not very long, the movie. I guess you have to do that with documentaries. You got to kind of keep them in bite-sized morsels.
Yeah, I think it moves. I watch it and I'm like, oh my God, look what just happened. It's only 20 minutes in. So much story has happened. It is super dense.
Yeah.
Because the story is super dense. And as we've talked about, it really does cover nearly 20 years, of content. And it's riveting, I think. I think the movie's riveting.
It is. I just said it. It was riveting. It is riveting.
I think the movie is so compelling because Jake, Josh, Andy Stepanian, Kevin Jonas, Lauren Gazzola, Darius Fulmer, and that was Josh Harper. This is Jake Conroy here. They were all so candid and, I guess, emotionally present when we talked to them, and were really generous with their time with us, letting us interview them multiple times over the many years that it took to complete the film. And some of those first interviews for us were really just understanding what was important to talk about and what was really happening, and then we would go back and continue to explore. So because they were also open with us, you really do get this sense of like the hero's journey, which was something we thought about a lot when we were making it, right? And I think that oftentimes when you hear these stories in the news and somebody's going to jail for this or that, you don't really understand who they are. And I think why this film will hopefully speak to people who aren't just like even activists, let alone animal rights activists, is because they were so emotionally present with us. Like you can see yourselves in every single one of them. There's something, they're people and you get to know them, and then you go on this journey with them.
I like that we sort of started this conversation around those things that we feel strongly about and how free speech and activism is associated with those things, meaning you should have the ability to call out bad things happening in the culture, and I'm sure there's a disagreement and reasonable disagreement about certain things, and there's probably things that we look at, I would consider lab testing on animals to be among them, those things that we can all agree are awful, particularly given, as I said, there is no useful purpose for it apart from just making money. But to your point, which is the chilling effect. It's almost to understate it to say it's a chilling effect. I mean, it's a crushing effect on free speech and activism. And so you now have trouble turning the spotlight on certain things. It may have to do with, virtually anything, all of the different ways that we are threatened as people, how the environment that we live in is threatened. It may have to do with government. You may feel as though we should change, it might be a Supreme Court case, whatever it might be. I mean, there's so many ways in which we are activists or concerned as people. It might just have to do with the school board. You know, it might be something super local. But you see the intense chilling effect that this has, a crushing effect. So I like that we started there, and I like that this is really what the movie's about. It's trying to take on these massive institutions of power and seeing how they crush. It's depressing, to be honest. It's a bit...
Yeah,
Will I be depressed at the end of the film?
I hope not,
Okay.
because I do think that, you know, it's completely logical that institutions of power want to protect their status quo. They want to protect that power, right? And so they want to control the narrative. And they did in this case. They controlled this narrative. They told the story. But this is now a retelling of the story. And that's why corporations and the government controls the narrative, because people are inherently, I think, great. And I think people have really good hearts. And I think they knew that if this story wasn't controlled, that this campaign was going to win. So the more we can tell this story, and this is still going on, there's still a fight to be had here. And at the end of the film, we really do try, and Jake beautifully, I think, kind of draws the lines between different movements, you know, that it's not about earth liberation, human liberation, or animal liberation. It's about collective liberation. Everyone wants to be free, and until everyone's free, nobody's free, right? So we just have to keep telling these stories and making sure that the proper narrative is reaching people. And I believe that that once they have that, then they control the narrative. And that's a really hopeful thing, right? You see people all over the world rising up right now, particularly. And that's awesome. And a movie like this not only retells the narrative, but it also provides some direction for what you can do with the energy you have when you're, you know, working against the immovable object. There's ways to crack it.
Yeah, I would even add that you see it's not depressing. In a way, it's empowering.
Yeah.
Because you get angry at what's happened to these people who, as I say, are really fighting a righteous battle. Everybody who watches this film is going to get it. The arithmetic here is real easy. And yet you also see the arithmetic of these huge institutions of power, these huge corporate interests that don't want to see any interruption in their money flow, in their revenue stream. And anyone who wants to speak out, I mean, I think it will feel empowered, enraged, and they'll feel a passion that I think will, at the end of things, really make people more committed to speaking out. And that's my sense of it anyway. Jake, tell us about your life post-trial and post-ordeal, might be the way to put it.
I don't know, how spoilery do we want to get?
I'll lead it and then you take it. I mean,
go.
what I will say is that this did not go well for any of the defendants in the moment, right? And it continued to not go well as they continued to try to fight it. But what's really beautiful is that they're still here with us now, and they're still speaking out. And Jake, what are you doing now?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely had an uphill battle, and it was a tough one. But, you know, all this time later, the idea and the passion to change the world is still something that burns deep within me. So, you know, I work with an organization now called Rainforest Action Network. We do similar campaigns to what we did against Huntington Life Sciences, minus like the downfalls of it. But, you know, doing pressure campaigns and encouraging banks to stop financing fossil fuel extraction projects. We work with pressure campaigns against the food industry to stop sourcing palm oil from deforested areas in Indonesia, you know, to protect critical habitat for endangered species that live there, as well as indigenous communities. And we support and uplift and amplify the voices of indigenous and frontline communities in their fights and their struggles around the world to protect the things that we all need to survive.
You said something there I want to follow up on. You said, I'm doing these things minus you referenced something like
yeah, not so much of the getting in trouble, getting arrested for terrorism type of stuff.
Right.
We're keeping it above board here.
Right.
Well, I mean, what got the six of you in quote unquote trouble is the fact that on your website and within your beautifully designed newsletter, Jake designed the newsletter.
I see.
That you guys were vocally in support of all different kinds of actions. Really? So is it that kind of thing that you mean, that you can't vocally support like a range of actions? Or?
No, I think the Shack movement was pretty radical at times. And I think that, you know, when you're working with a handful of people around a thrift store table in a row house in Pennsylvania, it's a lot easier for the full force of the government to come down on you in really big ways. I think when you're working with an NGO that's been around for 30 plus years, you have 50 employees, you have employees all around the world, and you're part of a network of large green NGOs. It's much harder to take down. It doesn't mean that they don't try. It just looks a little different. So I think we're a little more protected that way, a little bit more, depending on what state of the country and the government we're in.
You were a grassroots effort in such a real grassroots way. And that's what you'll see in this movie. It's so cool. I mean, gosh, it's a real testament to people who can make a difference, and you really do. You make a difference. I mean, I understand that you get steamrolled by the powers, but what we see is you're bringing tremendous attention to such I think, a critical story that occurs in darkness. No one shows light on this. And the last thing I would say, and then I'll shut up and we'll finish up, but I do care about the animal world and the way we treat animals as a whole. And the ag-gag laws that exist in this country are related to just the sort of thing that we saw in your early revelations about what was going on in those laboratories. And what the ag-gag laws are, I'm just telling them to the audience real quick to give them a sense, is, again, it's a way that the corporate ownership shuts down any kind of voice. So you can't photograph, record, or otherwise document any of the stuff that goes on in a factory farm, in a fur farm, in any of the means of production that are associated with our food, for example. So you can't document any. I'm not talking about the slaughterhouse. I'm talking about in the raising of these animals and the way they are tortured, and everything from brutalized to sodomized to otherwise subjected to every manner of awfulness. Mm-hmm. You can't document it because the documentation is so powerful that it produces almost immediate change.
But I also think it's super important to remember that the heart of the ag-gag laws is that they are anti-whistleblower, essentially what they are. And I think that needs to be said, because I think that's a real wake-up call to the country. I mean, that's a hot topic right now, is whistleblowers and how important they are in the role of our country.
Great point. Great point. I know it can certainly be broadened. All of these issues can be broadened. That's absolutely right. I was speaking about it only specifically to animals, but Jake's so right. Calling out corporate malfeasance of any kind. Mm-hmm. I mean, all of a sudden, these whistleblowers, and their whistleblower laws, but it would, whistleblowers themselves suffer enormously after the whistleblowing incident.
Right. I mean, but we see how, like, the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and that was applied to our case because it was a fringe movement, and then it was allowed to snowball into bigger and bigger things. And we see that with the ag-gag laws as well, right? It's whistleblowers, anti-whistleblowing amongst this fringe little group of people that are trying to expose what's going on in factory farms. But it's just a matter of time before those things and anti-whistleblower laws and it become bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
So well said. You, Casey, you don't come from the activism world per se that I know of. I know at least your work, your film work. Mm-hmm. You did a film about the Wu-Tang Clan. Is that right?
I did. I had the great privilege of being able to be a part of several documentaries. We did one called Rock the Bells that was about reuniting the Wu-Tang Clan, which sadly ended up being their last performance as a group with ODB. I had the great privilege of working on a film about Tupac Shakur called Tupac Thug Angel. That was just taught me so much about the world and humanity. Tupac was a beautiful individual. That was a great honor. And I also got to work on a few other movies in that world. It was all Beef and Beef 2, which is about a lot, on its face, about the history of the MC battle, but really about so much more than that. So those working on those movies was really an honor of a lifetime.
Are you the voice of the young black community, is what you're telling me?
I am not. I am most certainly not, but I have had the privilege to meet some people who are.
Yeah. And I also just love the fact that you come from that world. I mean, as a filmmaker, I'm talking about, I understand.
Right.
And into this world, and you put together such a
I wouldn't say
film.
I come from that world. I would say I had the most one of the more happiest accents of my life stumbling into that world and went on this journey with some really talented individuals. Peter Spire, who directed a great film called Rhyme and Reason that everyone should see, and QD3, which is Quincy Jones's son, who had an amazing vision to tell the story of hip-hop and some really terrific partnerships with which to do that, and some really amazing archival footage. So that's where I really learned about documentary filmmaking.
You were working on that? Is that what you're talking about?
I was working with that group, yeah.
I see.
And so that's really where I learned about this art and kind of fell in love with it, because before that I was interested in narrative film, and I still have some narrative sci-fi projects I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But, the power of talking to people, and to me that's so much more interesting than sitting down and writing something in my own imagination, is helping bring someone else's story to life. So as my personal journey took me into this space, into the world of the animal rights community, because I had become a vegetarian, and I was exploring this world for a scripted movie that I did with my co-director, Dennis Hennelly, called Bold Native, which everyone can see at boldnative.com for free.
And what is Bold Native about?
Bold Native is about a young man who breaks the law in order to free animals. And the FBI comes down on him, and his father tries to find him. So it was really like...
Wait a minute. You did that as a narrative project before you did this?
Yeah. That was something that my partner and I used to live in Chicago. And we were just really, I guess, inspired by and curious about people who would break the law in order to free animals, who would risk their own freedom in order to free a non-human animal. And that was just as I was kind of being awoken to these issues of animal rights. And so we started kind of like a deep cross-country exploration as we were doing the research for that project. And that's really how I learned initially about the Shack campaign, and kind of peripherally followed it, knew about it. And that was pre-9/11. That was pre-Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, And I remember thinking when 9/11 happened and understanding how the kind of attention that the FBI was already putting on these activists and these actions, just being like, wow, they were really paying attention to the wrong thing,
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know any of that. How you ended up in this stream. You were already really there in a way.
Yeah, like as a friendly outsider.
Yeah.
As an empathetic outsider, I would say, yeah. But it's been, this has been like such a tremendous journey for me, like learning from these amazing people, both like the 6 people who are the heroes of the film and the anti-heroes of the government.
Right.
But also the tremendous activists who worked alongside them in parallel, who didn't even make the cut. We talked to some amazing individuals. And of course, because it's only 90 minutes, some of them don't even get like the 3 seconds of screen time that a few others do,
Yeah, it's so sad that way.
Yeah, it is.
It's got to be like picking between children almost, you know what I mean? What do you do?
Yeah, but these are all like heroes to me. I think anybody that's pushing against corporate overstep and corporate overreach and oppression is laudable. And I truly think like one of the things I want people to take away when they watch this movie is, when they're driving by a protest and they're annoyed and it's a nuisance because their car slows down and they have to deal with traffic and they're yelling, get a job, and all those things that people do at protests. I want them instead to be grateful that there are people who are just as busy as they are, have, the same kind of pressures and do have jobs and things that the obligations that they have, and yet they still take the time away from that selflessly to go out and stand up against oppression. And I think that is laudable, and I want people to think about that and think about activism differently when they watch this movie.
I'm going to ask you this, and then we're going to wrap up. But if I don't ask you about this, then I'm going to get emails going, how come you didn't ask him? Okay, so ask you. Because all of us operate in sort of our own world, and the 6 people at the center of this film that operate in these worlds that overlap. What I mean is, family, friends. What was the reaction as you began sort of this passage down this sort of dark legal horror show? I mean, what did your folks say? What did your friends say? Or the people that you cared about? What did they say, and what everybody else's say?
Yeah. Geez, I mean, like I said, I'd been arrested so many times in the past that I think my family and friends were kind of used to it. And so it was more about the issue that that sparked their interest one way or another. Oh, you got arrested protesting against fur? Well, we don't like fur, then we're okay with it. My mom, who is a nurse, she found out that I was arrested for protesting against animal testing. That was not okay. Like, that was a bigger discussion. But I think as like she and everyone else started to learn that there was a much more like nefarious portion of this campaign or this investigation, and and how kind of crooked and corrupt and kind of underhanded it was, I think it really kind of politicized my mom particularly, and friends of mine that weren't activists, and started to realize like there is something to this activism, and there is something to it because we can see the response that the government has to it, right? They're not trying to stop people that aren't accomplishing anything and aren't changing anything. They're trying to stop people that have a direct effect on their ability to operate and make money. And I think as people start to realize that and see the case, and realize that is true, and that is the world that we live in. And I think because of that, people start realizing, like, I also need to participate in some way in fighting back against oppression and fighting back against this corrupt world that we kind of live in.
In general, the families and friends of all the, quote, defendants, they rallied around them.
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
I think it's worth remembering, and the film tries to scratch at this a little bit, but it's worth remembering that all the rights we now take for granted and how those rights have extended over the years have not come easily, right? Like they come at a cost and they come with a fight. And so that's something I think people should consider when they watch this movie as well, that while they're sitting very comfortable, with their right to vote in their pocket and their, I mean, gosh, we have a long way to go, right? But we have also come a long way, and that's worth considering. How did we get here?
The new documentary, The Animal People, is available where and how?
The Animal People is available on iTunes and other streaming platforms where you can watch it right now. You can order it for a friend. I think it makes a wonderful birthday present. Pay it forward. I mean, the people in this film, the story was taken away from them. That narrative was taken away. And I think it's a wonderful thing to gift somebody because you can kind of tell that story forward. So I'd like to see that happening.
And, I'll tell you something else, just independent of a cause. I love documentaries. I'll watch a documentary. I mean, I love a bunch of different documentaries have to do with every kind of manner of thing. It's a window on so many different slices of our existence. And so even if you have no general interest in this particular thing, maybe you're not interested in activism, maybe you're just sitting on the couch watching a bowl game or something, whatever. But if you're into documentaries, and there are people into war documentaries and all the different documentaries, this documentary moves, man. It's riveting. And the real footage and the almost real-time nature of accounts and of video, it really keeps it going. So I encourage people to check it out. It's called The Animal People. Yes, order it, reorder it. Get it for friends. It's a great story. I mean, again, I don't mean to be a shill for it, but I'm so proud of the work you've done, Jake, and that you would come share some time with us. It means a lot. It really does.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Jake Conroy, and of course, Casey Suchan. You know her from the Wu-Tang Clan, and now she's doing The Animal People. Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. Thanks to Michael Shure. Thanks to Casey Suchan and Jake Conroy once again. And thanks to you, all the ways you support our show. If you want to reach us, it's edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. And until next time, bye-bye.
Hello, this is Morgan Freeman. And I want to thank you so much for all the ways that you support my friends on The Edge with Mark Thompson. You can listen on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, iHeartRadio, and many places that great podcasts are heard. That's an oxymoron, by the way. Great podcasts. Or you can go to their website, edge-show.com. Well, still haven't purchased a new domain name, I see.
edge-show.com.